We are very excited to have Katie and Sarah here tonight. They both work at the Land Trust Baltimore Green Space. Katie is the executive director, and Sarah leads the programming and site support related to green space preservation in the city, as well as working on garden stewardship. So they're going to talk about some of the work that they do with Baltimore Green Space. And it's a land trust, the Baltimore Green Space, that was founded in 2007 by a group of community gardeners who wanted to see their community's open spaces remain available to residents. Since 2007, they've grown to protect over 62 acres of community-led gardens, as well as pocket parks, which is a new phrase for me, and forests. They serve residents who are dedicated to preserving open spaces throughout the city through partnership-based community outreach, resourcing, education, and stewardship cultivation. So great, sounds like a great group. The talk tonight will provide some examples of this work of Baltimore Green Space and its impacts for conservation education, as well as, of course, land enhancements in urban settings. They're going to provide us with some examples of their community-based work with native plant ecosystems, from forests and their edges to more landscape meadow patches, as well as pollinator gardens. The talk will highlight their strategies for increasing and protecting native plantings, including planting, of course, more native plants along forest edges, protecting rare species, and all of our favorite invasive species management. They're also going to talk about the Pollinator Power Project, which is designed to implement native landscaping through the resources of protected green spaces and their communities of stewards across the city. Through the Pollinator Power Project, the organization is integrating both community-level ecological education about natives, data collection, and societal celebrations of pollinators, something that I'm sure we all aspire to do. The talk will also highlight particular species that have succeeded in these environments and work across the growing season's increasingly erratic conditions under climate change to provide conservation value. Across these examples, they will reflect on the importance of native plant education and engagement in urban communities. Additionally, we will consider the possible advocacy implications of what we've learned about how to be a good member of a native plant community in these settings. I love that phrasing, to think of ourselves as members of the native plant community. Of course we are. We're part of the ecology. So I really like that. I'm very excited about the talk, as you can tell. So let me tell you a little bit about our speakers, and then I'll hand it over to them. Katie, I don't know how you pronounce your last name, Lautar. You can correct me when you get going or now if you like. But she took the helm of Baltimore Green Space as its executive director after working there for 7 years as the project director. She was born and raised in Baltimore, and she came to this work through her love of Baltimore, nature, and communities. She has more than 16 years of experience in community organizing, designing nonprofit programs, and creating educational programs. She has a master's degree in environmental education from Lesley University. While living outdoors in different bioregions, I'm very curious about that. Maybe we can ask her about what that means in the question and answers. She earned her bachelor's degree at Goucher College in elementary education with a minor in peace studies. She has directed youth development and education programs at Strong City, Baltimore, and is a founder of the 2640 Cooperative. She also has considerable experience in consensus building models and collaborative program development, something that is really important in these days. Always, but just always important, but feeling especially relevant in these days. Sarah Diadama leads the programming and site support related to green space preservation for Baltimore Green Space, as well as garden stewardship. She grew up in Catonsville and then spent many years living abroad and working abroad before returning to the area and claiming Baltimore as her home in 2015. As part of her career in secondary and post-secondary education, Sarah completed a PhD in cultural studies in 2022 that focused on higher education as social infrastructure in the US and Canada. Her long-term interest in infrastructure also extends to urban ecology, botany, local agriculture, mutual aid and land-based history and rehabilitation. Sarah has been an active member of Baltimore's urban agricultural community since 2019. She has been a core member of 2 green spaces preserved by Baltimore Green Space, Hidden Harvest Farm in the Greenmount West neighborhood, and Ash Street Garden in Hamden. Through these spaces, Sarah has pursued community organizing and partnership-based community-led development, food distribution, ecological restoration, youth outreach in the city. You can often find Sarah at one of these gardens or at another of the city's farms, or walking in the city's forest trails and along the Jones Fall, where she is an avid birder. I'm sure you will all agree that this is going to be a very exciting talk and touch on many different points that we're all interested in. So I'll hand it over to you guys, and thank you so much for bringing us your wisdom tonight.
Wonderful. Was a great introduction, and you covered some of what we were prepared to cover too. And we're gonna kind of fly through a series of slides, but before I start that, I want to tell you that we've made a lot of use of the resources on your website for serving community. The Invaders of the Mid-Atlantic Guide we've used pretty regularly, and we're grateful for the work that your team has done and advocacy, as well as providing resources and education. And please know that it extends far beyond this meeting room. So we're going to talk to you about you already heard the overview of the presentation. And I'm going to go a little bit into who we are with some examples. As you've already heard, Baltimore Green Space is a community-centered conservation land trust. We preserve community gardens, pocket parks, and forests, and we also teach people how to care for forests. In addition to that, we do a series of advocacy, and we created the policy by which Baltimore can transfer land for $1 per lot to a qualified land trust. And we've also spearheaded several pieces of legislation that protect forests and trees with a partnership of advocates. I wanted to show you a few examples of the spaces that we protect. This is Upper Fells Point Community Garden. It is the only unpaved surface in Upper Fells. This is the pit, a magical tiny horseshoe pit in Pigtown. This is 500 North Duncan Community Garden, and it's a food and flower garden. There's actually a bunch more native shrubs and trees in there these days. This is Mount Clair Community Garden. This is the community garden we protect that has a pond and chickens and lots of natives and food. And this is Springfield Woods. Now, this is only a tiny little picture of the 21 spaces and over 62 acres of land we protect, but I wanted to give you some images to tie to what we're talking about when we talk about preservation in Baltimore City. Sarah?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Katie. So yeah, I wanted to give you all an overview of some of the nuts and bolts kind of work that what Katie just glossed includes. So as Prue summarized in the opening, since our founding, we have grown over time to now protect over 62 acres of community green space. That acreage number is really skewed by the presence of a large urban wildlife refuge, a very wonderful place called Masonville Cove in South Baltimore that I hope some of you come to visit if you ever visit the city. That's almost 50 acres. So most of the spaces are quite small in their acreage and kind of operate as a little ecological patchwork around the neighborhoods of the city. And that protected site group currently includes this list, this rundown on the right that you see. 7 food gardens, 8 pocket parks. Sometimes we call those sitting parks as well. 2 community farms, 2 forest patches, and the horseshoe pit you just saw pictured, a sort of cultural heritage preservation site. And we have 6 more sites currently in the pipeline. Most of those are pocket parks or gardens as well. And I work with this network of sites and also lots of other stewards in the city who are not part of a protected site, and provide them with a range of different kinds of resourcing that they definitely need in their, wonderful unpaid voluntary stewardship of land. Of course, one of the kind of most important offerings we provide is land security. As Prue mentioned, the land trust began when a community food garden was threatened by a developer that they would lose their space. And so that's really the principle that undergirds the entire preservation part of our work. We are trying to uplift community development in the forms that exist in Baltimore and protect the loss of those neighborhood assets that really keep people in their communities and in their neighborhoods for a long time from the various patterns and waves of development that happen in the city. And we partner with the city government to accomplish that, which is a great outcome of that policy that Katie just showcased. So they transfer land to us for $1. It's property tax exempt, and we continue to work with them to do the second thing listed here, which is troubleshooting various issues that come up in land use. And sometimes that's very nuts and bolts things for the work people are doing, like having access to water or waste management issues. And other times it's more technical or administrative stuff they need support with. We also provide technical assistance. I do a lot of it directly as a co-practitioner, but also connect people to other experts in the area who are willing to help with this kind of education work or come out to sites and troubleshoot an issue. That can also include hosting events or uplifting events partners are hosting that are relevant information for our practitioners, or supplying people with volunteer labor, which they certainly need from time to time. And lastly, we provide liability insurance coverage on all of the sites in our land trust. It's really important. Almost everyone is doing this work unpaid and voluntary. So we want to make sure that they feel some safety in their commitment. So as we start to talk about the kind of what we're doing with native plantings on Baltimore City's land, we thought it would be prudent to give you a quick overview of the context of Baltimore's land, which is pretty specific, and you may be aware of it already, but the maps I'm about to quickly run through are pretty stark, and so I hope that will illuminate the work that we're part of. This map here is a fairly famous classic map at this point. It showcases the historical policy of redlining of housing access in Baltimore City that excluded Black people and other people of color from accessing housing in the central parts of the city that were the most resourced and continue to be the most resourced today. And so as a result of that policy and others, we used to, at our height, at this sort of full scale of Baltimore City, have a population of close to 1 million people, and that population has almost halved by the 2020 census numbers to 593,000. So what that means is that there is a great deal of city land once developed that is now vacant in some form or another. Some of that is vacant buildings and some of it is vacant lots. And the city government has slowly come around to the term of blight as a description for some of this land, which is a great thing. They're now working with us on remediating it more. But I want you to notice here, if you look at the blue dots, which is where we might show up in our work, those are the vacant lots. Those are empty, quote unquote, right, lots that either have turf grass or invasives or maybe some trees and become quite weedy. And the kind of default of that land is that it's managed by kind of whacking and mowing periodically, but a lot of it might not see other transformation in any kind of short timeline. This is a map Baltimore Green Space created to try to illuminate how community has responded to this land use situation over time. These dots that kind of scatter across the map, as you can hopefully see overlay onto that historical redlining map, these are the places where the most activity has been taken by residents to create green spaces for themselves, for their neighborhoods, for the city. And we wanted to make it clear that people have intervened to remediate this land and to do so constructively in a way that benefits them as residents as well as the city's environment.
And I just want to add that, despite the disinvestment in Black communities have specifically been investing in their own green spaces for an intense amount of time throughout this history of redlining.
Yeah, there's a framework that's often used in the city, created by Dr. Lawrence Brown, a professor of public health at Morgan State, which is called the white L and the black butterfly. If you ever come through the city and talk to city folks, most people know about this. And you can kind of see it here in the central corridor. There's it's where most development has concentrated in an L that runs right down the center of the map. Johns Hopkins is at the top, in Roland Park, and then all the way down to the right over to Canton. And of course, the surrounding neighborhoods are what Dr. Lawrence Brown, himself a Black man, has called the black butterfly, because that is where the Black populations were sort of pushed to living. So this map shows really what Katie was saying, which is just how much reinvestment Black communities have displayed in the city that they were relegated to.
And Sarah, I think I'll pick up the next slide, but I also wanted to add that, this is the map of 400 spaces that we have, over 400 spaces we have in our database. There is an additional 400 we're adding that was worked on through what's called Project Vital, we were a part of with the Bloomberg School of Public Health. And you can see that full map, which will actually really show a butterfly shape if you look up Project Vital map. And so once we started, Baltimore Green Space has always believed in order to know what to protect, you have to know what you have. So we started with the mapping of the regular green spaces, and always directed by community interest, community care, community investment. And the forest patch side of the work is no different. We became involved in wanting to understand where Baltimore's forest patches are when neighbors requested that of us. And we were able to conduct unique analysis mapping with the U.S. Forest Service, Dr. Baker at UMBC, and with support from the Baltimore Office of Sustainability to map where Baltimore's forest patches are, where there are a lot of native plants and trees, as you might imagine. There are over 2,000, and it's more than 20% of Baltimore City's tree canopy. Take this, Sarah. Back to you.
Thanks, Katie. So in this context, where we have a lot of land that is not being developed, basically, right? We are left to kind of imagine, like, what do we do? What might we do with this land? And what is the tendency of this land that we have? It does have tendencies, right? And so we want to talk to you tonight about forests and gardens or parks as a kind of stand-in site for meadow habitat. So we, of course, can recognize that there used to be different land use practices. There was indigenous burning every 3 to 5 years of large landscapes, Soldier's Delight being a famous example of this, where this has continued as a practice in Maryland. There was a wide array of beaver habitat, and they were doing land management for us. And then, of course, farmers used to leave large areas of agricultural land fallow for years at a time, and those would become ephemeral meadows. But we are really kind of using all of our land productively now. So the opportunity for ephemeral meadows to continuously develop year to year really kind of fell out from the land use patterns. And of course, also Baltimore City was primarily forested land historically, some of it swamp, so kind of wetland woods, and it left to its own, the tendency of that land is to revert to forest. We also have tons of volunteer trees in our kind of more mixed disturbed little mini biomes around the city, and they will take off over time and create a mini forest. So at scale, reversing this tendency towards forest in places that we don't want it requires as well as kind of cultivating meadow patches requires less mowing than we currently do. A practice called integrated vegetation management, which is the targeted application of herbicide to preserve the native plants that can form these ephemeral meadow environments. I know one of your members, Ashley Bowers, has been doing experiments to create some meadow habitat in city parkland and has experienced intense deer pressure. And that's another thing not listed here that is an impediment towards meadow habitat formation in the city. So I wanted to summarize before Katie and I kind of break out into discussing each of these two kind of arenas of our work, what exactly we're doing that involves native plants these days. And as Katie opened, all of our work happens with community members. We are not, generally speaking, doing direct land management. We don't have the capacity. We have a small staff. So we work in partnership with communities of stewards and experts and other practitioners who are open to the more scientific parts of our work. And so I wanted to kind of give you a list of the mix of what this involves, but to emphasize to you that all of this refers to working with community members in Baltimore. So on the forest side, there's been a lot of education about what existing native species we have in Baltimore City, which Katie is going to share a lot more detail with you about, but is actually quite an exciting baseline and not what people might guess. Invasives management, of course, is a huge part of that education work and any kind of rehabilitating work for forest land in the city. There are studies that we have overseen via planting native plants and seeing which outcompete invasives and documenting improved diversity in forest layers over time, enhancing forest floors with native seed mixes that are developed with experts in the forest field, conducting partnership-based and citizen forest science, and doing general education outreach for stewards and residents about the city's forested land. On the garden and pocket park side, I've been doing a lot of distributing of plants, local ecotype plants to our growers to encourage them to add to the, already voluminous work they do to grow plants, to introduce these other species into their relationship mix with plants, and to educate them about the ecological value of these plants, how to maintain them, and different practices for naturalist gardening, which often differ quite a lot from some of their norms around gardening. Offering workshops about pollinator species and habitat needs, conducting citizen science with the goal of creating planting guides for city land use, and also just generally kind of encouraging more awareness and advocacy that helps the city confront this default that I mentioned of the weedy, grassy lot through advocacy work that we do as well as education work. So I'm going to turn it to Katie with this question. Little origin story for you. How did we begin to start this work? How did native plants come into the picture for Baltimore Green Space?
Well, I won't say it's exactly how we started the work with forest stewards, because the work with actually, I'll just say how the work with forest stewards and forests in Baltimore started with neighbors reaching out to us saying, what can you do? Can you help protect our forests? How can you help us take care of this? What do we do? Is this a good plant or a bad plant? Do we keep this? How do we get these? What do we do with these vines? And so the images you're seeing right now are of Miss Mabel Smith. She's one of the founders of the Forest Stewardship Network, along with Butch Berry, who was one of the founders of the Forest Stewardship Network. They have since passed on, but they hold me accountable from beyond to the mission and vision of making sure that we are always working with and for and collaboratively with community. So we were working in gardens, and we got asked by several neighbors, including these neighbors, to visit their forests, to check it out, to help them protect it. And we were like, whoa, can we protect a forest? We hadn't yet, right? We were only at that point protecting 3 green spaces, but only one of which was larger. And then as we got to talking about forest patches and forests in cities, when we were in ecological networks, everybody talked about the forest like they were going to look just like this invasive, it's like invasive trees. Everybody wanted to talk about ailanthus. Like that's the only thing you would ever see in a Baltimore City forest patch. And it's not, it is the case that this is actually a vine invaded forest, which has some very old trees underneath of it. So this is a real place in Baltimore, but it's not emblematic of all of the forest patches in Baltimore. And in fact, this is another version of a forest patch in Baltimore. As you can see, has very healthy layers. It has so many species of oaks in it. It has white oak seedlings. It has the most healthy native flora. And we were seeing things like this pink lady slipper orchid on our visits. And that combined with working with neighbors and wanting to always come from a lens of like, what are we here to protect? Like helping people understand and read the landscape in a way that helps them to retain native species and honor the landscape in the ways that they wanted to anyway. That's always kind of how folks were wanting to learn. So everything we do is guided by our forest stewardship network. You can see in the right-hand corner here, this is a stewardship network meeting, which always includes both experts and forest stewards. You might even recognize some leaders that in these pictures if you so, and we do cleanups, a combination of cleanups, education, and projects that both simultaneously teach people how to care for their forest, but also why to love their forest, right? So we do birding events in addition to cleanups, in addition to practical work. And as we kind of got more and more immersed in this work, we wanted to understand where the forest patches were. We wanted to understand if the analysis we had done that mapped the forest patches actually identified forest patches. So not only did we work on the mapping of forest patches using, data layers, we actually did on-the-ground surveys of 88 of them in order to establish a baseline in every region of the city of kind of what the picture of the forest was. And that kind of later escalated it into us while serving community, wanting to actually be able to present a full forest health picture. And we've since developed this forest health protocol and conducted it in actually more than 54 forests. Now I have a series of fellows that are finishing right now. You can check out the protocol. It's being used by many different cities. It is in the process of being adopted as part of the Maryland State Protocol. And as we did this in an effort both to help neighbors understand their forests, because we couldn't have them do a forest management plan with a state forester because they didn't own the land. So we had to figure out what's our workaround to tell them about forest health here. And what we learned after hearing all about all the invasive trees we were going to see, which we kept not seeing, we were able to quantify that Baltimore City's tree canopy is more than 85% native trees in the ones that we've sampled. Here's another example of that. So you can see the species diversity across Fairwood Forest. This is one of the forests we protect. It's the only forested ridge in the city. It's a hawk flyway, and it also has an 85% native tree canopy. I'm back to the pink lady slipper orchids because I want to talk to you about the rare and threatened species that we see, just because this is just such a pretty one. But, we've documented sawtooth goldenrod we're one of the only other places that's in Springfield Woods that it's documented. And so part of our strategy, even when doing invasive vine removal, is to invite experts like experts in this meeting to come out with us to flag everything that's native before anybody begins any project. And then we teach about the natives as part of the invasive vine removal strategy. We start with, what is it we are here to protect? And then we do ID of invasives in our villainous vines training, but that's a different topic. So here's another example of this. Let's see, which one is this? It doesn't think this is hep. Yeah. Hep forest, which I showed you a picture of earlier. This is how much native ground cover we're looking at there. It has almost no invasive ground cover, which is wild. Yay, something magical. So we facilitate all this work by, like I said, doing educational events and leveraging volunteers and producing educational guides about plants that are related to the actual spaces we're in. And what we've learned over time and been able to document is that sites that this is one of our charts that shows the canopy invasion. And it shows that so you'll see in 2016, the canopy invasion was much higher than in 2022 or 2021 at all of these sites. And what all of these sites have in common is active forest stewards helping to manage invasives. And over time, we've been able to document that the species diversity is increasing year over year with the invasive removal. So here's some species lists of both tree species and ground cover species for different forest patches. For those of you, I saw some of our Blue Water Baltimore family is here. They've helped us. They've worked on the forest legislation, and they know a bunch of these places. So Still Meadow, Bliss Meadow, Fairwood Forest, these are their species lists. And having these species lists enables us to teach community and engage community around the actual plant community that is present in their neighborhood. Some other examples of species cover, let's see, this is showing that the native species is increasing, has increased over the past 2 years in this space. Now, this is Springfield Woods, and one of the things we've done at Springfield is we're conducting edge experiments at Springfield and Fairwood. We're conducting edge experiments of native plantings to see what native plants might outcompete invasives at the edge and how successful which plants are successful at coming back, at spreading out, at outcompeting, and at drawing wildlife. And in the very first year, we saw like double the hummingbirds visit the edge. So this is another example of where we're able to document that community participation and engagement is improving the canopy. So on the left side, you see an image where it's orange and red. And that means if it's red, it means that the vines were already in the canopy. And then on the right-hand side, you see that it's yellow. Yellow means, oh, there's no more vines in the canopy, but there's still some on the ground. It's lower down in the canopy. And you can see the health of the canopy is increasing, and it's similarly true at the forest floor. So I have a map that mimics this one that shows you almost the same thing as it relates to the ground cover. So we look at both ground cover and we look both at ground cover and canopy cover. So our most recent published paper is this one. And the exciting part of being able to analyze over time what's happening, like what's at the ground layer at so many different patches, is we were able to see patterns of where forest edge species end and forest interior dwelling species begin. And in the patches, we're able to document they begin at about 40 meters from the edge consistently. This paper has so much more fun information. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. I'm not going to go super into it. That the most important fact there is kind of like this understanding that there is a pattern of where the edge and the interior species trade places. Not really trade places, but stop and start. And that has management implications over time. This paper also outlines the common forest communities that are in the patches. It kind of documents all of that stuff. Okay, so takeaways for this part of the talk, and then I'm going to hand it over to Sarah, are you can't protect what you don't know you have, right? And so part of our mission is to, while collaborating with neighbors, make sure that we're documenting what we're seeing, actually doing analysis. We have a huge native canopy to protect. Something else we've worked with scientists on is looking at the history of the landscape, and of the 2000 patches, kind of knowing which ones are the oldest. And there's a set of the forests that have a core that are more than 100 years old. Like 50% of them are more than 100 years old. So we're not talking about young, brand new forests. We're talking about forests that have been left for quite some time to become magical places. So we have native, rare, and threatened species on our forest floor, and we also have them living in the habitat. So there are bird species, et cetera, that are living in these places. And it's easier to know if you're making progress if you're documenting it over time. So we've been able to use all of this to leverage advocacy towards supporting community stewardship, changing regulations, supporting your invasive species law. We were able to actually document that English ivy was the worst invader at all of these places.
I want to summarize one thing that Katie often says. Katie does a lot of narrative leadership for our organization, and one of the things that she does in her advocacy work is say that we are fighting against the maxim that forests take care of themselves, right? So I hope that you took that away from everything that she just shared, that we really want to celebrate stewardship.
Yeah, there's this perception that forests take care of themselves, and that I'm not even, well, that may be true in a healthy forest ecology, but when you're in an urban setting with urban pressures and with fragmentation, forests need our help in staying healthy because of all of the plants that have been introduced. And then another thing that's actually not true about our urban forests is that we have as much deer pressure. The parks do because they're connected, but the patches have way less deer pressure. And so we do have seedlings, and I like to call them adolescent trees, the ones that are above the seedlings. We have layers, you know?
Awesome. Thank you. So I want to shift us now to thinking about that meadow and forest kind of range I laid out earlier, and applying the meadow framework to gardens and small green spaces. And how do we do that, right? How do I kind of take things I've been able to learn from meadow ecologists and adapt them for a patchwork of green spaces, or even one green space or one bed in a green space is sometimes what I'm working with. So what I'm sharing in these next two slides is kind of the framework that I am sharing with the stewards I'm doing education with. I think you guys know all of this stuff, but I want you to understand as an educator, like, how am I kind of inviting people in to this new set of relationships? And I say it that way because they are already working really hard. They are doing a lot of active maintenance labor all the time to grow the plants that they like to grow for a range of reasons. And we are calling them into expanding that load in a way, right? And to developing more relationships and deepening those relationships. And so I want to be able to give people good reasons for doing that and a bunch of different ways to engage with that and be incentivized to engage with that. And so my section of this talk tonight is going to kind of cover a bunch of different types of that education work I'm doing, and then also discuss at length a kind of longer term project we were able to do last year. So the first kind of adaptation for meadow ecology that I see is kind of developing constructive land use practices in the city. And this is supported by the literature. I'm sure you all know this, that a network of meadow patches in a city is still an ecology. It turns out it is sufficient to resource the pollinator species that we need for our food web. We need to sustain life at scale. So I wanted to uplift this article that came out last fall. I believe the host cities are in Sweden, but super similar project to what I'm going to talk about later. If you want to look up this article, it's a great overview of which different species kind of do best with these patches, and bees and hoverflies did a little bit better than butterflies, if you're wondering. Also, this is just broadly part of the movement that's happening toward native plant work in our country to kind of rehabilitate basic ecosystem services everywhere that we can. And the stakes of that are fairly high, that this is a kind of secondary crisis of the biodiversity crisis that I talk to people about as you know, related to climate change, but distinct, and one we can intervene in a little more easily. And of course, also native plantings restore soil itself, right? It's not just all habitat stuff or foraging resources. They do a lot to the land as biomass as well. And also the other framework, you know, that one's the constructive one. We're creating things together. We're deepening and expanding our communities to include non-human members, et cetera, right? And then there's also the more activist version of that, which is to intervene in the land use crisis. And, you know, this is a generalized crisis, I would say, across our country. It's not specific to urban settings, but we can do specific interventions in an urban setting because we have a lot of people power. So you can see a picture here on the right of what used to be a community garden space. It's now defunct. And this is kind of representative of what that land use default I mentioned earlier might look like. It's a vacant lot, but it does have a lot of plants growing in it, some invasives, some perennial ground cover. There might be a few things that a bee could forage in there, right? But it certainly doesn't look like it's in community use, or it doesn't look particularly inviting or beautiful, or like it's offering anybody any service in this form. And I wanted to also uplift an article, recent article on this topic, where that examined what the services provided to pollinator species by lots just like this one in post-industrial city settings are doing for those pollinators. We often hear that, oh, if you just like let the plants grow out a little more, some flowers will emerge from the clover or other weeds, and that will be sufficient, maybe some chicory, right, to feed some bees. But it turns out there's a high risk in assuming that that default is sufficient, because these formerly industrialized areas have trace heavy metals in their soils, which are taken up in the plants and actually poison many pollinator species. So this is an article that came out in April of this year on that topic, using Cleveland as its study site. If you're curious to read more about that, I think those were industrial brownfields, so probably one of the worst examples of this. But I think it's important to not just kind of assume that we can default to something and that it's fine. So this is one of the ways that I approach talking to our stewards about this. People don't necessarily have the language of stewardship all the time as like community members doing green space work. And we're calling them into that language, and also opening up like what that is, right? What are you stewarding exactly? Who is it for? What does it include? And so that's part of conservation education. And it's also part of like shifting what our maintenance of the land as work is. And so here's a kind of spectrum which shows a different level of investment in land maintenance and the benefits that would accrue to various species that rely on accessing meadow plants in open lots. And so just to kind of show the cost and benefit range, where sure, we could do any of these, but like we would need to weigh these considerations as stewards and consider if that's really where we want to land and if we might have capacity to do more. So a couple of examples of types of technical assistance that I'm giving people who are already stewarding spaces, right? Which is most of the people that I talk to. People don't come to me raw saying like, how do I plant native plants? Usually they have a lot of relationships to plants already, but not a lot of relationships to native plants. And it's a big learning curve. It was for me. I had to educate myself deeply. I had to be constantly curious and to recognize that people need ongoing education about these plants, what they do over time, how to care for them from season to season and year to year, and ways that they can actively shift some of their baseline practices. So of course, when we hear a lot, because there is a lot of value to turf grass kinds of land, it provides recreation area for families, children, sports, you know, it is valued in an urban setting. I don't want us to be anti-lawn, right, fully. So there's some things you can do for those types of land. You can mow less frequently to maintain clover growth. So there's a recommendation to reduce mowing to like every 3 weeks or maybe more if you can. You can cut down tall grasses to expose their woody stalks to provide nesting habitat for native bees in your kind of seasonal maintenance. You can maintain a layer of fallen leaves rather than bagging them up. Still really not making a lot of progress on this one in the city, to be honest. But, you know, one suggestion for that is to bunch them into select areas so that it looks intentional and somebody isn't going to assume they need to leaf blow this whole area. To provide some habitat space and also to do some, you know, stormwater landscaping, to install rain gardens with native pollinator plants that can help us with these shifting rain cycle patterns that we're experiencing that can be very heavy and disruptive. For garden spaces, again, these are quite active growing spaces. They have a lot of density already in their plantings. So I'm trying to insert like additional tactics and get people to see the benefits of adding them into the mix. So companion planting, you know, this is a great way to talk about community membership, right? Inclusive of plants or of other species like our pollinator friends or birds. So you can kind of maximize the hospitality of your garden space or your park space by interplanting with plants that get along. Planting flowers in clumps. I'm sure you all know this, but to reduce the travel time that individual insects have between plants, to make sure there's successive blooming across the growing season. Plenty of our gardeners know these kinds of principles already, and what we're adding is the native plant varieties that they aren't familiar with, and you know, will increase the diversity of pollinator species, hopefully, and also recommending that people plant guilds at the bases of trees or layered plantings in their gardens to provide additional habitat opportunities. So different herbaceous layers, flowering shrubs, ferns, grasses, and ground cover other than, you know, Bermuda grass, our enemy. This is an example of, you know, you see a lot of cool recommendations for ways to do habitat gardening when you engage with native plant experts. And one of them is the bug snug, which this is a photo on the right that I borrowed from someone else. Kind of making a little teepee structure with layering a bunch of carbon matter, brown matter in it. And this, unfortunately, is not a great recommendation for an urban setting where rats are also part of our communities and would love to tunnel into this pile or any other pile. And so some of our innovative stewards came up with an adaptation of this kind of idea into a structure that I'm not sure if you can see, but it's actually a group of pallets built several feet off the ground. And then we stuffed that pallet structure with the same kind of material to create a habitat space that was not particularly interesting to rats. So kind of creative thinking like that to deal with the dense ecologies that we have is always necessary. And I wanted to just kind of summarize some of the things that I'm teaching people about in case any of these are interesting to you to discuss. Cultural management of invasives, always we have to talk about, and there's a range of practices that I'm trying to kind of share with people from, you know, more broad scale land management or more resource kinds of professional management. cover cropping and the use of frontier species. My favorite right now is partridge pea, just so enamored with this species and what it can do to remediate land and make room for additional other natives. And green waste management is a huge topic I've had to research. When you have a lot of herbaceous plants that you're intentionally growing, and then you need to cut them at certain points in the season, or you need to weed out other tall plants, people need a way to break down that material in pretty small spaces that they have. They don't have large tracts of land that's lie fallow where they can spread that stuff out to break down. And so kind of gathering practices from experts that help people deal with their waste as well as support habitat formation in our spaces. Teaching people about seed keeping, seed practices, and what happens with seeds in their soil. This is something a lot of people did not really know about, despite weeding every year. And so I'm glad that native plants have allowed us to talk more about that. Adding soil amendments to build biomass and support more invertebrate life. And water retention, talking about the life cycles and resource needs of our pollinator species that we have in the city, which includes a lot of native bees, actually. Watering practices for our dysregulated hydrological cycle. So that's like been a big challenge for native planting is, you know, recognizing that they are hardy once they get to a certain stage in their lives, but early on, they need a lot of TLC, just like any other annual. Assisting with native plant ID and care, just a huge learning curve that's constant. I the other day showed someone the difference between Canadian goldenrod and ragweed. Very, very similar. They were next to each other. It was a perfect opportunity. Talking about some of our indicator species from pollinators and what kinds of biodiversity we might see in the city, and what other resources exist in Baltimore City and the region for people to resource themselves as growers trying to take on this work. So on the right here, I just want to share, this is Victor Bennett of Wildside Nursery, a relatively young nursery operation. I think it's in its third or fourth year, but he's doing really amazing leadership, working with communities, doing re-landscaping with natives, and that's his nursery in Moncton. And he's been giving our community members lots of plants through our programs this year. So I want to now discuss, this will get you guys to like another species list and be a little more sciencey. A big project that I coordinated across 2024 that was awarded to Baltimore Green Space by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. This is part of their Chesapeake Wild program, and so was seen specifically as Baltimore City contributing to a patchwork of conservation and land rehabilitation projects throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. It was the first time a grant like that was awarded to a city, so it was exciting for us to get to pilot a project under this august title. And we had a few different goals. One was to enhance our stewardship in an urban setting toward greater conservation value, and to help support ecosystem robustness in the city. To do what I've been discussing, which is kind of address the biodiversity and land use crises impacting key pollinator species everywhere. And we are lucky that we had resources already organized into a network and we could mobilize those people. And we did so by asking if they wanted to be part of this. And most people said yes, some people said no. And they also helped guide the project itself and many of its elements. So we're lucky that we have a lot of willing stewards who are open to learning. And then we also wanted to stage a circular economy across some related organizations, which I'll share more about in a moment, to contribute to this work. And so we wanted to kind of distribute our grant resources in a way that supported other people's work in the city as well and fostered more relationships and partnerships, because that's how all of this will sustain itself over time. So some of those partners on the left here, we're using a well-worn strategy in the city, which is do a pilot project, show that it can happen, and then maybe there'll be some uptake by the government. So on the left here, our partners for this project were White House Nursery in Hampstead, Maryland. They're a really wonderful partner. I want to highlight to you that they, one of their staff members kind of was my liaison for this project, and she sourced local ecotype species for every single thing that we requested. And she, in many cases, had to source from wholesalers who typically work with large-scale land conservancies on major planting projects. And it was a new thing for her nursery to do something like this at a small scale, required her to form new relationships within her industry and do more research. I just want to highlight that like there are some of these industry barriers to like doing a project like this that we're still working out each time.
Sarah, I just want to quickly add something, which is that White House Nursery for years and years gave Baltimore Green Space's sites free plants at the end of every season. And when we finally got the opportunity to consider, we were dreaming up this project, we were like, what if White House Nursery could grow all of our plants? And that's another reason that happened.
Yeah, no, and they're still doing the seedlings donation. It's mainly vegetable plants, some perennials, but they're feeding a lot of people actually in the city that way. We also worked with Division Street Outdoor Contracting, led by Alex Smith, who is a wonderful naturalist himself, and a leader in the Black landscaping community in the city. And you know, he at one point like set up an outdoor classroom where we had all the plants, and he put up signs to teach his crew because it was a learning curve for everyone. We also partnered with the USGS Native Bee Inventorying and Monitoring Lab at the Patuxent Research Refuge in Laurel, Maryland. I think some of you have probably worked with them. They're wonderful leaders in our state and region for work like this. And before I continue, I want to highlight, of course, that the lab is currently being threatened by the congressional budget cuts that have been proposed, and that I wanted to make sure you all knew that that phrase in the title that you all liked, a good member of a plant community, that phrase came from native pollinator biologist Claire Maffey, because that is how she has had to write about their work since they can no longer use the word diversity. That is the substitute phrase they have come up with, being a good member of a plant community, which I think is actually really pedagogical and lovely. So I just want you all to know what the inspiration for that was. And also we partnered with many green space stewards and their community members. We initially approached 12 sites about this, who said yes. It winnowed down to 10 throughout the project, and just capacity reasons. And you can see the list of all of the participating sites on the right. As I mentioned before, you can go to our website and read about each of these individual spaces and see where they're located. But a mix of pocket parks and food gardens and 2 farms participated.
And all of the participants, including Division Street outdoor contracting leaders, contributed to the design of the project.
And they were all paid. Not the USGS, they donated their time very kindly, but we paid all of the stewards, of course, contracted with the other folks. And that was a really important part of this work. This kind of project has never been done with pay. I'll explain that in a moment. So we were really glad to be able to resource people's time who were willing to help us with this project. I wanted to just uplift the Bee Lab a little bit more. Some images from a visit that I did there. You can see some of their experimental bee habitats on the right, especially for natives, and on the left, their naturalist landscaping style. It's a really wonderful place. Please lend them your support if you can. So we were working with Claire, as well as a graduate student who invented a citizen science protocol that our stewards participated in, and with Sam Drogi as well, who helped us a bit with the study design, and some other support team that they had, some other students they were working with. So this is a slice of the broader maps that you saw earlier of the city that shows where all of the sites that we put in habitat gardens were. So it's kind of the center and west of the city. I want to share just a quick overview of like what we did exactly. So all of this was developed collaboratively with all of the folks just mentioned. We worked with Claire to come up with a list of plants appropriate to the cultural conditions at each site. And then the stewards had the opportunity to review those, make requests for swaps per their preferences. And then the nursery grew out all of these plants for us, some from seed. And that was new for them, which was quite cool to hear about. And then we installed these new habitat gardens at 12 sites in May and June of 2024. It was extremely hot and a relative drought at the time. So we were working under climate pressure. And the challenge was, of course, watering more than anything else. So we trained the stewards in the characteristics and care of 30 species of native perennial plants, all native to Maryland, and talked about the resources that they offer to pollinators across the season. I will also share that that work is ongoing, right? Like learning this many new plants is not something people can do in a month. Unless they're maybe paid to do it every day like I was. We train site leaders in how to monitor pollinator activity, as well as the baseline presence of floral resources in their gardens. They were looking at 2 bee species, carpenter bees and bumblebees, because they are indicator species that you can observe with your naked eye. They don't require catch and kill. And they also submitted that data to a protocol, citizen science protocol invented at the Bee Lab called Ask a Bumblebee, where you basically observe what are all the floral resources available in this square footage area. You rank which has the greatest number of flower blooms open of all the species you see. And then you also tally any bees that you see in that patch on which plant. And, just wanted to highlight that in total, over 3,600 native plants were cultivated in this partnership with the nursery. The outcome of all of this is we got weekly data monitoring from June through October at all of the sites that remained participants at 10 sites. And the pollinator biologists did site visits to meet with the community members, observe what they saw, and share insights on the like hyper local ecologies they were observing at some of these sites. And just to share one example, one of the farms that has a lot of biodiversity already, Claire observed a wasp that has evolved to parasitize one other insect. And she said she has never seen anything like that in an urban setting. It's just a high level of specificity. So that was a great sign that the habitat work is real and happening. And we can kind of feed that back to the stewards in the same way that Katie can share those impacts of their stewardship graphs in the forest settings. This is just to showcase some of the works that we did in 2024. So you can see like a whole container bed really has thrived. The Joe Pye we put in that bed is like 7 feet tall this year. This is some of the crew, Alex and his crew in the center with one of our gardeners. You can see a guild that we created, which is also now like 6 feet tall under this tree on the right, and some other community installation work below. So I want to talk briefly about some of the results. I have a bunch of tables and graphs. I'm going to move kind of quickly, and we can come back to any of these in the questions if you'd like. So this is a list of the species where bees were observed. So on the right, you can see the kind of range of species we put in that despite not having any observations of bee presence, they still were serving the habitat garden function that we intended. And also, I just want to make a caveat here generally, which is that usually a pollinator study like this is staged over 3 years. And so we weren't sure how much we were going to be able to observe in just one growing season. And it was fairly normal to see that like these, shrubs are not going to be productive of flowers in year 1. And so that was not a surprise. That was kind of part of our design. And so what we're really seeing in some ways is like who was able to flower under extreme heat in one season and be productive and be robust for our pollinator species. You can see that Mistflower did incredibly well in its year 1, and has, really, I think has a really like ease of entry for people because it's also quite cute and, does not get to be 6 feet tall and make people a little worried. Goldenrod, of course, always high on the list. Wild bergamot or monardas are always high on the list. We had swamp milkweed be incredibly successful in the city, which was interesting. Not necessarily particularly wet places, but they loved the full sun. They got really tall within the first year. And boneset also, I would imagine that in year 2, the Joe Pye would also be as numerous, but boneset was also really successful in the first year. So these are just some photos to remind you all of what species we are talking about. This is the mist flower in different stages. And in my work with the stewards, you know, we gave them seedlings. We just did goldenrods for the asters. I think it was what was easy for the nursery to accomplish and what was recommended by Claire. I'm also working with the stewards to teach them about, these plants will reseed themselves and expand year to year, and they'll fill in the gaps, or you can collect the seeds and you can do winter germination for the next year and expand your garden in another patch of your space. You know, been doing all those kinds of education work with folks. And Golden Alexander's was hugely successful, like has been amazing ground cover after just one season, really filled out. You know, a lot of the spaces where we planted had never had any plantings before. They were really poor soil, very little there, and we had to kind of build the bed from nothing and see what would thrive. And the Golden Alexander's is incredibly forgiving. I saw that Prue mentioned it earlier in garden settings as well as forests. Okay, so some top level results to just keep sharing those. We set up the study to have monitors compare our kind of pollinator plant enhanced garden area with an area with the same square footage at a neighboring empty vacant lot, weedy lot, right? So that we could kind of see an impact of if we enhance these sites in this way, you know, how does that compare to the baseline of what a lot of the city's land is like, and what is seen as kind of compliant with the city code, which is like keeping it mowed or keeping it contained. And after just one growing season, there was a huge preference for foraging in the sites we had planted compared to these control sites. So this is an initial graph that covers all of the things I talked about. So plant species richness, plant genus richness, floral observations, so just sheer numbers of flowers observed, bumblebee count tallies of bumblebees observed, and tallies of carpenter bees observed. So you can see a comparison here between the control sites and the planted sites and just how dramatic the difference is across those types of sites. The carpenter bees and bumblebees just are kind of supposed to be present in a healthy ecosystem in the city. Like they're a very normal baseline species. If this ecosystem is healthy, they should be able to thrive. So that's what I mean by indicator species, is like, if it's a really unhappy ecosystem, you would probably not see them. But if there are enough resources for reproduction year to year, those species should be there. I wanted to just share top species that we found because we want to recommend people plant them in our urban setting or elsewhere. They came from plant families: hibiscus, goldenrods, eupatorium, which is bonesets and Joe Pye, milkweeds, and bee balms. And we also wanted to highlight that a lot of the species that occur in our weedy lots that are seen as kind of de facto foraging resources did not do particularly well. We saw very few bees on those plants, and that includes clover, which was one of the most numerous plants cited in bloom. So this is just to showcase again those final results. We can talk more about that if we have time. And just to summarize for you that overall 91.7% of all bee observations and 88.6% of all carpenter bee observations occurred in the sites that we planted. And I just wanted to highlight that I'm continuing this work that was a highly specialized and kind of more scientific version of this kind of work. But I just hosted a couple weeks ago a container pollinator gardening workshop at Masonville Cove. And we pitched this as a kind of accessible version of doing this sort of stewardship for people who don't have access to land, who maybe only have a stairwell or a balcony or a roof. And we saw incredible demand, like the most demand they have ever seen for a program there. And they want to do this every year. And so I just want you all to know that, like, this is a culture shift that is really happening and people are interested in being part of it, even when they don't have a lot of resources to participate.
This is just our standard. How can you help? Become a volunteer, join our mailing list, donate. I think I recognize a few donor names in this list. So thank you for your already donating to Baltimore Green Space, and your legacy just generally of educating others and learning about plants has been so useful in many different arenas. This is our contact information, and now we'll open it up for any more questions you have. I tried to answer the questions as we were going, and also we can talk more.
That was really fantastic. Thank you. It was really inspiring. Great, just doing great work. Would love to hear more and talk to you guys more. I would definitely like those plant lists, which I already talked about in the chat, but I'm sure that many
Yeah.
people here would like those plant lists.
And one of the things, it's like, it becomes kind of hard to tell everything that you did when
Yeah.
you're setting up one of these like scientific projects or community related projects. Something that we had like a really high need for was labeling the plants and having plant signage. And so there were lots of different iterations of what that looked like. Which was also really cool. And Sarah's telling me about one of the neighborhoods that actually has like a laminated like education book that's like hanging now in the garden. And so just really cool stuff.
So can we find those plant lists on your website?
You can't find them on our website, but we will send them to you because it's like there's a couple different projects and the different projects have different plant palettes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
We do have one question in the chat. Autumn asks, have there been studies on alternative bug snugs that measure effects on diversity of bugs that use them?
I have no idea. That's a great question. Yeah, it's a good thing to look into. I think, yeah, I think that we don't know as much as we probably should in the city about the different nesting habits of different types of species that are common here. And because we were really asking people to focus on observing 2 species, you know, we have to create a foundation for observational practice, which is just so fundamental to doing this work. So yeah, I appreciate that nudge, and I will look into it. I'll see what we can observe in the one that's active. I think it was probably its first year this last winter really having inhabitants, and so hopefully we'll learn more this winter.
Yeah, we're always developing innovations that either our neighbors teach us because they learn something and then we try to spread it out. Another thing that we learned with the plantings is, you know, we plant plugs densely with teams because it's easier for neighbors to plant plugs than it is to do a lot of digging because we're working a lot more with elders and with children. So there's all these like alterations to make things more accessible in the process.
So with plugs, I prefer plugs because they're less expensive, and I actually find I have more success with plugs than I do with bigger things in general. So I just think I think you don't have to apologize for using plugs.
Yeah, it's just an interesting because when we're doing research, it's like the industry standard for some things, especially as it relates to forests, is about like planting bigger trees, like
Oh,
and like trying to like using a crew to plant a lot of trees at once. And we're like, yeah, but what about the understory? And what about we don't have a whole crew, so how do we do something similar? You know, because we don't want to remove a lot of invasives without replanting something. So we often have a married replanting strategy with the invasive removal.
You mentioned about how you get different green spaces into the land trust. And while you guys were talking about your incredible work, I was like, there's this green space that's just like an empty lot near my house that I've just been dreaming of becoming a wonderful meadow or something like that instead. And your guys' work seems like it could help facilitate that. I guess the question is, it like that you guys work with groups that already have things established, or do you help groups also get things established? And yeah, that's I kind of maybe too many questions inside
Not,
of that.
not at all. Not at all. Theoretically, yeah, we do all of that.
Cool.
So the main thing I'll emphasize is that because we're a small team, I don't have the capacity to like come out and plant with you, unfortunately, though I would probably be into that. But Yeah, we have, I organize resources for people at kind of every stage, and a lot of people are just starting, and they're wonderful people to hear from because they're being gripped by the life force, you know, they want to do something constructive, and to see change. And so, yeah, I definitely would want to hear from you. Do you live in the city?
Yeah, I'm up in the north end of Waverly, where like Penn Lucy, Waverly, and Guilford touch.
There
Amazing.
are so many green spaces in your neighborhood. Yes, Sarah can
Yeah.
totally help you.
Yeah, you should email me and we'll talk more.
Will
Yeah.
do, definitely. Yeah.
Thanks for asking. One thing I might add that you guys might find provocative to hear, you know, it's been such an interesting process to like realize that people really don't know a lot about these plants, despite knowing a lot about other plants, and to kind of figure out how to navigate that with folks. And at the same time, I've noticed over the last several years, probably 5 or so, that there really is a shift happening kind of at the retail layer to promote native plants in nurseries, which I think is great. But often people will know the more charismatic flowering plants, right? Like echinacea or something. And so I often kind of feel like our work is great. Start with those, you know, please go for it. But like, how can we get you excited about these like herbaceous plants that are not going to perform for you necessarily? So that's kind of where it feels like my work has landed in a lot of ways.
Sarah, do you know this answer to this leaf grow question? I know the city collects the leaves. I don't know what they do with them. Do you know the answer?
I do. It's a very sad one. I'm sorry, Jill. They incinerate them. Yeah. And you know, it's continues to be the case despite the city having a pilot composting program. It's really nonsensical, because they're polluting residents.
The question was from Jill about yard waste. Montgomery County mulches their yard waste into leaf grow, and she was asking whether Baltimore City has a similar program, and apparently the answer is no.
Yeah, we often put out calls for our composting system at the farm I'm part of for people to not put their leaves out at the curb and give them to us instead. It's an advocacy front to keep working on. We are making strides with composting, and I think people haven't realized all the streams that they can make use of.
Something else I want to say is Eric Fischel is our forest program manager. I'm the founder of the forest side of our work, but Eric does the on the ground work, and he would have presented this work to you and probably even very differently, but he's on vacation. So I want to acknowledge that, you know, a lot of the work that I presented is his work under my leadership. So I can also like give you Eric's email address and in case you want to know more about all the details of the forest.
Regarding herbicide and insecticide, I don't feel like our gardens really use those much. People are pretty organic. If anything, they might use fertilizer. But my experience is not having issues with this. Like the closest thing to it is like someone's using rat poison.
I would say the using of pesticides and herbicides might be more frequent in the forest work that we do. And we don't apply any herbicides without working with a professional, and then we use them very sparingly. We do more hand removal than anything else. Although it doesn't necessarily keep neighbors from, the poison ivy is the one thing that it's really hard for neighbors to manage. There's a lot of poison ivy in the forest, and encouraging neighbors to engage with their forests isn't compatible with allowing for poison ivy to be close to the pathways and where kids are playing. And so I would say that is what ends up prompting forest stewards to attempt to use herbicide more often than anything, is to manage poison ivy.
I also want to shout out Ashley Bowers again. The city actually the health department actually requires a permission letter from them to apply it. And so there's a network of folks called Weed Warriors in the city who help sites with these kinds of overgrowth problems. Ashley's one of those. And she donated some of her time to do a permitted application of herbicide to treat pervasive ailanthus at one of the sites in our pipeline. So I got to do that with her and kind of see it play out and teach the community about that process. But we made sure to let them know that she was licensed and we were going to have her do it and not them, you know.
We will let our wonderful speakers go have a rest after that fantastic presentation. I wish that you could hear us all clapping. There's so many thank you for your lovely talk, your inspiring talk, comments in the chat, which I reckon you saw, but it really was fantastic. So I'm sure you'll be hearing from many of us.
Yeah, I want to also thank you guys so much for your love of plants. It's nice to know we're not the only strange ones.
No, I think Sarah had a really nice comment, feeling the life force, the pull of the life force. So with that, thank you, everybody, and thanks for coming, and hopefully see you soon, and stay cool and enjoy being part of your native plant community.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you guys so much.
This week. Take care.
Okay,
care.
bye. Thank you.